Professor Karen Wall-Jorgensen, Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Culture, thank you for joining me this morning to discuss the US election. It's been enthralling watching it day by day and basically watching it unfold ahead of November the 3rd, the big day. I've been checking the polls daily, looking again this morning, and we've seen Joe Biden on averaging 50% most days, Trump coming up at around 43% today, Biden having a 10-point lead on occasions throughout the campaign. Let's start off by looking at the candidates, how they've both been performing.
Well, I think that really Joe Biden's strategy, which has been quite successful, is to by and large stay off the sort of physical campaign trail in terms of things like rallies and walkabouts and all the traditional kind of spectacle associated with a campaign. And he has been staying in his basement and doing a lot of social media work and interviews from there. But by and large, just sort of letting Trump lose the election for himself by engaging in his own brand of campaigning. So that to me seems to have been Biden's strategy, one of kind of hunkering down a bit and staying in his basement and trying to kind of control the messaging through social media and through crafted televised advertising as well, and then through doing a lot of more virtual campaigning. So what we've seen from Trump, by contrast, is an attempt at hanging on to the traditional campaigning style of doing these large-scale rallies, of trying to get out there, talking to people. So a much more traditional model that's obviously been more challenging to do in the context of a global pandemic.
We know from 2016 that if you lead in the polls, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be the winner. Hillary Clinton led, winning nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. She still lost because the US uses an electoral college system. So winning votes doesn't always win you the election. Can you explain how that system works?
Well, basically the way it works is that in each state in the United States, the candidate has to win the electoral votes for the states, and that is usually based on getting the popular vote within each state. So if Donald Trump has one more votes than Joe Biden in Florida, he takes all of the electoral state votes for the state of Florida. So what that means is that you can win the popular vote in the country overall, potentially by millions, but still lose the electoral college votes because your opponent might have won in particular swing states, in particularly important states. And there are some states that are really big in terms of population, states like Florida and California. If you win the electoral votes in those states, then you'd stand a much better chance of winning overall. So it's basically a question of winning a majority of these. That's 270 electoral college votes that the winner has to secure. And so that depends on how the vote progresses state by state rather than in the country overall.
Looking at the campaign trail right now, we've got Biden and Trump crisscrossing the Midwestern states. It's a coronavirus red zone, and the pandemic has basically dominated this campaign. At the start of the year, we saw Donald Trump with his flagrant attitude towards the virus. When he caught it, we thought he'd soften and he'd say, actually, do you know what, the measures need to get tougher, I need to get on the mask. But he seems to stick with his bulldog stance, doesn't he? He sticks to what his line is the whole time. There's been no diversion.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's actually been damaging to him. So his stance throughout the whole year, throughout 2020 and leading into the campaign, has been to more or less deny or downplay the severity of the coronavirus pandemic. But that obviously flies in the face of evidence and increasingly also in the face of the experience of his voters. And one thing that I think is important to remember is that a lot of the people who voted for Trump in 2016 were among the elderly population. And that is exactly the population that is now feeling particularly fearful of the pandemic. So I think that one thing that Trump has somewhat underestimated is the fear in the population and the extent to which his approach of denying or downplaying the coronavirus pandemic does not sit well with people who are afraid of the virus.
But does America need consistency right now? He's been in power for a number of years. People know him, they know how he operates. He's quite a strong leader, quite powerful leader on the world stage especially. Do they still need him as president and commander-in-chief?
I think that at the moment, what is most urgently needed is for someone to take charge of the pandemic and to take decisive action on the pandemic. And Trump has consistently refused to do that. What concerns me somewhat as a journalism and media scholar is the fact that Trump has engaged in consistent attacks on democratic institutions, including the mass media. And now increasingly, he's also suggesting that he might actually question the outcome of the election itself. I'm concerned in terms of his attacks on democratic institutions. In terms of what America needs, he's clearly someone who has cultivated a very loyal following amongst members of the American population and the electorate. And a lot of people will be sticking with him and think he's done the right thing. But from the perspective of the pandemic, I think that there's widespread agreement that he hasn't handled it as well. And that might prove to be the critical issue in terms of determining the outcome of the election.
You say Biden's stayed indoors, followed the rules almost, hasn't he? The regulations, kept his distance. And we've seen videos of him, a softer side to Biden, maybe with younger people, children, victims of crime. He's got a much warmer personality than Trump. But is that enough to win this election?
Well, I think that, to be honest, I think it's pretty clear that Biden's not necessarily the most charismatic candidate. Equally, there are concerns about his age. As we know, both of the candidates are in their 70s, although Biden is just a tad older than Trump is, and that has been raised as a major issue. So I wouldn't say that he is the most stellar candidate the Democratic Party has ever produced. But likewise, I think for a lot of American voters at this particular point in time, it's simply a matter of wanting Trump out of office and of voting for pretty much anybody other than Trump.
The TV debates have been more about personal attacks at times than policy. What have been the key takeaways?
Well, I think that one of the really striking things, certainly in the first debate, was, as you said, a strong emphasis there on personal attacks, but also clearly Trump not playing by the rules. So there are very strict rules concerning the conduct of the debates. These are premised on the idea that the candidates do not interrupt each other. And Trump very consistently interrupted Biden to the point that Biden had an outburst saying, "Will you just shut up, man?" And so that exchange and the whole conduct of the first debate was seen as very unpresidential, both on the part of Trump, but also to some extent Biden. So it's very uncommon to see candidates actually losing their temper, interrupting each other, playing dirty in the context of the debates. And it's so unusual that the rules were changed in advance of the second debate so as to prevent any interruptions. And that did affect the sort of nature of the second debate, which became a bit more tempered, a bit more kind of more presidential conduct that we would commonly see. So I think the takeaway is that Trump has not played by the rules. And again, it's not very clear that that's something that's necessarily benefited Biden greatly. He did get a boost in the polls after the first debate, whereas opinions were a bit more divided after the second debate.
The pandemic's totally changed the election process this year too, and a record number, 82 million people, apparently just been checking the information of that, have already cast their votes by mail. That's 59.5% of the total number that cast their votes for the 2016 election, and around 60% of voting eligible Americans have voted in recent elections. So do you think that because of this change, because people are voting more by post, that there'll be a rise in numbers?
Well, I think that there are a lot of indications that this will be a high turnout election. So as you pointed out, historically speaking, turnout has tended to be quite low in presidential elections, hovering around 60%. And predictions are that turnout will be much higher in this election, despite the really unusual circumstances, which actually make it quite difficult to vote. So it's a little bit too early to tell what it's going to look like, because as you suggested, we have very unusual circumstances, which mean that more people will be voting in advance. But there are a lot of indications that people are very keen to vote in this election because they think that important issues are at stake. And that's true whether they support Biden or Trump.
I love an election. I like staying up to watch it, watching the 50 states go. But I think on this one, it might be a long night. It might even go over a period of days because of that postal ballot. How long do you think it will take for the actual result to emerge?
Well, some of the states will be still counting postal and absentee ballots up to about 10 days after the actual election day. So it's really difficult to say exactly when a winner can be declared in any kind of authoritative way. And I think that really represents a break with tradition where, historically speaking, US media like to declare a winner on election night itself. Obviously, this time we'll have to arm ourselves with a bit more patience because we're unlikely to see an immediate result.